thousands of years before the pyramids cast their shadows across Egyptian sands. We're talking about the Sumerian texts, those ancient whispers from Mesopotamia, and what they reveal about beings called the Anunnaki, deities who the ancient world believed shaped the very fabric of human existence. Before we begin this journey through time, if you enjoy this kind of content, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely find value in what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, connecting across time zones over stories that transcend time itself. Now, settle in. Dim the lights if you can, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum that helps you focus. Let's ease into tonight's exploration together, because what we're about to discuss isn't just ancient history. It's a window into how our ancestors understood creation, divinity, labor, rebellion, and the very purpose of human existence. The Sumerians, those remarkable people who flourished between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq, left us something profound. They left us their stories, pressed into clay with wedge-shaped marks that we call cuneiform, and these stories speak of gods who descended from the heavens, gods who toiled and created, gods who made decisions that would echo through every generation that followed. The Anunnaki. The name itself carries weight, doesn't it? It rolls off the tongue with a kind of ancient authority, a sound that seems to belong to temple chambers and torchlit ceremonies. In the Sumerian language, this term likely derives from An, the god of heaven, combined with elements suggesting princely seed or those of royal lineage. But who exactly were these Anunnaki? According to the ancient texts, they were the principal gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, the great deities who held dominion over the cosmos, over fate itself. They were the ones who decided the destinies of mortals and immortals alike, the beings who stood at the apex of divine power. But here's where it gets interesting, where the clay tablets begin to reveal something more complex than simple god worship. The Sumerians didn't just revere these beings as distant, unknowable forces. They wrote about them with specificity, with detail, as if recording actual events, actual interactions. The texts speak of a time before humans walked the earth, a time when only gods inhabited the world. They describe how these gods organized themselves into hierarchies, how they divided labor and responsibilities, how they established cities and temples, how they even grew weary of their work. This isn't the mythology of all-powerful, effortless divinity. This is something else, something that reads more like a chronicle of beings with tremendous power, yet also with limitations, with needs, with conflicts. The ancient scribes who pressed their styluses into soft clay weren't writing fantasy, at least not as they understood it. They were recording what they believed to be the history of how the world came to be, how humanity came into existence, and why things were the way they were. And central to all of this were the Anunnaki, these gods from the heavens who, according to the texts, descended to earth with purpose and intention. To understand the Anunnaki, we must first understand the world that gave birth to their stories. Picture Mesopotamia in the 4th millennium before our Common Era, a land unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. Between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, a civilization was taking root that would change the course of human history. This wasn't an easy land, not like the predictable flooding of the Nile that made Egypt's agriculture almost automatic. The rivers of Mesopotamia were wild, unpredictable, sometimes flooding with devastating force, sometimes withholding their waters when crops needed them most. Survival here required something special, something that would set the Sumerians apart from other peoples of their time. It required organization, cooperation, engineering, and innovation on a scale never before attempted. The Sumerians responded to this challenge by creating one of the world's first true civilizations. They dug canals to control water flow, built levees to prevent destructive flooding, designed irrigation systems that could water fields far from the riverbanks. They constructed massive mud brick platforms called ziggurats, stepped pyramids that rose toward the sky, topped with temples where priests could commune with the gods. They developed mathematics to survey their land and calculate harvests. They created astronomy to track the seasons and predict the best times for planting and reaping. They invented the wheel, the plough, the sail, and perhaps most importantly, they invented writing. Around 3,200 years before the Common Era, Sumerian scribes began pressing marks into soft clay tablets, marks that represented not just pictures but sounds, ideas, abstract concepts. This cuneiform script, with its wedge-shaped characters, would become the vehicle through which the stories of the Anunnaki would be preserved for millennia. Think about that for a moment. Writing itself, one of humanity's most transformative innovations, emerging from this land between the rivers. And what did they choose to write about? Yes, they recorded trade transactions, tax receipts, property deeds, all the mundane necessities of an organized society. But they also wrote down their myths, their cosmology, their understanding of where they came from and why they existed. They wrote about the Anunnaki. City after city rose from the Mesopotamian plains. Eridu, perhaps the oldest, sat near where the great rivers approached the Persian Gulf. Ur, whose ziggurat still stands today, became a centre of trade and culture. Uruk, with its massive walls that, according to legend, the hero Gilgamesh himself had built. Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer, where the temple of Enlil, chief of the gods, commanded respect from all the surrounding city-states. Each city had its patron deity, its protector among the Anunnaki, and each competed for prestige, wealth, and divine favour. These weren't nomadic tribes telling stories around campfires, stories that would evolve and change with each telling. These were literate, organised societies with professional scribal schools, where young men spent years learning to read and write cuneiform. They copied and recopied ancient texts, preserving them, studying them, passing them down through generations. And what these texts tell us about the Anunnaki is both fascinating and, in many ways, unexpected. The Anunnaki weren't portrayed as a single unified entity, but rather as a complex pantheon with individual personalities, domains, and relationships. At the top stood Anu, the sky god, the father of the gods, though his active role in myths was often limited. His son Enlil, the lord of wind and storm, held more practical power, serving as the executive of divine will, the one who made things happen in the physical world. Then there was Enki, also called Ea in Akkadian sources, the god of fresh water, wisdom, and magic. Enki was portrayed as clever, sometimes too clever, a deity who often sided with humanity even when other gods wanted to punish or destroy the human race. His relationship with Enlil was complex, sometimes cooperative, sometimes antagonistic, and their interactions drive many of the most important myths. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, represented fertility, birth, and the earth itself. She worked with Enki in creating humanity, mixing clay with divine essence to form the first humans. Other important Anunnaki included Nana or Sin, the moon god, Utu or Shamash, the sun god who was also associated with justice, and Inanna or Ishtar, the goddess of love, war, and fertility. One of the most complex and powerful deities in the entire pantheon. These weren't distant, abstract forces. The texts describe them eating, drinking, feeling emotions, making mistakes, learning, changing their minds. The Sumerians built massive temples for them, performed daily rituals to feed them, clothe them, maintain their statues as if the gods literally lived within their sanctuaries. The relationship between gods and humans in Mesopotamian thought was transactional, practical. Humans served the gods, provided for their needs, and in return the gods were expected to protect their cities, ensure good harvests, and maintain cosmic order. But this wasn't blind faith or simple superstition. The texts reveal a sophisticated theological and philosophical framework, one that grappled with questions of purpose, suffering, justice, and the nature of divinity itself. And at the centre of this framework stood the Anunnaki, the great gods who had shaped the world and everything in it, including humanity itself. To understand what really happened when, according to these texts, the Anunnaki came to Earth, we need to look more closely at specific myths, specific tablets, that tell the story from beginning to end. Let's start with Eridu, because that's where the Sumerians themselves said everything began. Eridu, located in what is now southern Iraq, near the ancient coastline of the Persian Gulf, holds a special place in Sumerian consciousness. According to their records, Eridu was the first city ever created, the place where civilization itself was born, the spot where kingship first descended from heaven. The Sumerian king list, one of the most important historical documents from ancient Mesopotamia, begins with Eridu. After the kingship descended from heaven, it states, the kingship was in Eridu. This wasn't just propaganda or civic pride. Archaeological excavations at Tel Abu Shahrain, the modern name for ancient Eridu, have revealed occupation layers dating back to approximately 5,400 years before the Common Era, during what archaeologists call the Ubaid period. This makes Eridu one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in human history, but it wasn't just its age that made Eridu special to the Sumerians. It was who lived there, or rather, who was believed to live there. Eridu was the city of Enki, god of the underground freshwater ocean called the Abzu, god of wisdom, magic, crafts and creation. His temple in Eridu was called the Iabzu, the House of the Abzu, or sometimes Engur, the House of the Waters. This wasn't merely a place of worship. According to Sumerian belief, this was literally Enki's home, the place where the god himself resided, deep in the earth beneath the temple, in the Abzu where all life originated. Think about the symbolism here. Water in the desert, in the harsh Mesopotamian climate, meant life. The underground aquifer that fed springs and wells was mysterious, inexhaustible, essential. To the Sumerians, this wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was divine, the realm of Enki, and from this watery abyss, all of creation flowed. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have uncovered something remarkable. The Iabzu temple wasn't built once and left standing. It was rebuilt, reconstructed, expanded over and over again across thousands of years. Archaeologists have identified at least 18 different construction phases, each new temple built directly on top of the ruins of the previous one, each slightly larger, more elaborate than the last. The earliest temple, dating to about 5,500 years before the Common Era, was a simple structure, just a small room with what archaeologists interpret as an altar or offering table, and a niche that might have held a statue of Enki. But even this earlier shrine showed evidence of ritual activity. Fish bones and ash around the altar suggested that Enki's favourite offering was freshwater fish, appropriate for a water god. Over the centuries, as Eridu grew in importance, so did Enki's temple. By the late 4th millennium before the Common Era, during the Uruk period, the temple had become a massive structure, with columns several meters in diameter, decorated with thousands of clay cones arranged in mosaic patterns, their heads covered in copper, and some even topped with gold. Stone statues of lions guarded the entrances. The scale of this construction is stunning when you consider the technology available at the time. Everything was built by hand, with mud bricks, reeds, and bitumen. The labour required must have been enormous, requiring coordination of hundreds or thousands of workers over decades. Why would a community invest so much effort into building and rebuilding a temple? Because according to their texts, this was the dwelling place of one of the great Anunnaki, one of the gods who had created the world and who continued to protect and provide for their city. The texts tell us that Enki was more than just Eridu's patron deity. He was central to the story of creation itself, particularly the creation of humanity. But to understand that story, we need to understand what came before humans, what the world was like when only gods walked the earth. According to the Mesopotamian creation myths, preserved in several different versions but most completely in the Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish, the universe began with primordial chaos. In the Enuma Elish, this chaos was represented by two deities, Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water. Their mingling gave birth to the first generation of gods, and from them more gods were born, each generation becoming more powerful, more organized. But with organization came conflict. The younger gods were noisy, disruptive, keeping their elders from rest. Apsu wanted to destroy them, but Ea, another name for Enki, discovered the plot and killed Apsu first, claiming his realm as his own. This is why Enki Ea became associated with the Abzu, the freshwater deep. He had conquered it, made it his domain, built his temple there. But the story doesn't end with Apsu's death. Tiamat, enraged by the murder of her consort, created an army of monsters to destroy the younger gods. The gods were terrified, none willing to face Tiamat's wrath, until Marduk, son of Ea, Enki, stepped forward. Marduk agreed to fight Tiamat, but only if the other gods would make him their king, their supreme ruler. They agreed, and Marduk battled Tiamat, defeating her with winds and arrows splitting her body in two. From one half of her body he created the sky, from the other half, the Earth. He arranged the stars, set the moon and sun on their courses, organized the cosmos from chaos. This is the Enuma Elish's account, written down in Akkadian around 1200 years before the Common Era, though likely based on much older Sumerian sources. The Babylonians, who inherited much from the Sumerians, used this text in their New Year festival, reciting it to reaffirm Marduk's supremacy and remind themselves of how order had been established from primordial chaos. But there's another creation myth, one that focuses less on cosmic battles and more on the practical problems the gods faced. This is the Atrahasis epic, and it gives us a very different perspective on why humans came to exist. According to Atrahasis, after the cosmos was organized, after the heavens and earth were separated, after the great gods had divided their domains, there was work to be done. Someone needed to dig the canals that would control the rivers, maintain the irrigation systems that would water the fields, perform the endless labor necessary to keep the world functioning. The great Anunnaki, the senior gods like Anu, Enlil, and Enki, didn't do this work themselves. Instead, they assigned it to a group of lesser deities called the Igigi. The Igigi. This is where the story becomes fascinating because it introduces a concept that's surprisingly modern, surprisingly relatable. The Igigi were younger gods, subordinate to the great Anunnaki, and they were given all the hard labor that needed doing. The texts describe them digging the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, excavating canals, carrying heavy loads, working day and night without rest. For how long? The Atrahasis epic says they labored for 3,600 years, a symbolic number that represented 40 Nia, a Mesopotamian unit of time. 40 was a number of completeness, suggesting that the Igigi worked for a complete age, an entire era of toil and suffering, and then, inevitably, they'd had enough. The Atrahasis epic describes their rebellion in vivid terms. The Igigi gathered in secret, making plans, building their courage. Then, all together, they marched to the house of Enlil, the chief executive of the gods, the one who'd been making them work. They surrounded his dwelling in the night, and they did something dramatic and symbolic. They set fire to their tools, their spades and baskets, the implements of their labor. This wasn't a violent revolution. They didn't attack Enlil directly, but the message was clear. We will not work any longer. This ends now. Enlil woke to find his house surrounded, the night sky lit by burning tools. He was furious, terrified, calling this a declaration of war. He summoned Anu, the sky god, his father, and Enki, his brother, to decide what to do. Should they fight the Igigi? Should they punish them? But Enki, always the clever one, always the one who saw alternative solutions, suggested something different. He proposed that the Igigi's complaint was legitimate. The work was too hard, the burden too great, even for gods. They needed a different solution, a new kind of being who could take over the labor that the Igigi refused to do anymore. They needed to create workers who would serve the gods without rebellion, without complaint. They needed to create humanity. The goddess Ninhursag, the birth goddess, the one who presided over pregnancy and childbirth, was called to help with this task. But creating a new species wasn't simple. What would these creatures be made of? How would they be given life? The answer, according to the Atrahasis epic, was both poetic and dark. They would be fashioned from clay, from the earth itself, but mixed with something divine, something that would give them intelligence, awareness, the ability to understand and follow commands. That divine element would be blood, specifically the blood of a slain god. The texts are not entirely clear on which god was sacrificed for this purpose. Different versions give different names. In some tellings it was Weila or Wee, possibly one of the Igigi themselves, perhaps even their leader in the rebellion. In later Babylonian versions it became Geshtue or even Kingu, a figure from the Tiamat myth. But the principle remained the same. A god was killed, his blood was mixed with clay, and from this mixture the first humans were moulded. 7 males and 7 females in the first batch, created by Ninhursag with Enki's guidance and wisdom. The texts describe how she pinched off pieces of clay, shaped them, gave them form and breathed life into them. When the first humans opened their eyes, their purpose was already determined. They would take over the work that the Igigi had abandoned. They would dig the canals, tend the fields, maintain the temples, provide food and offerings for the gods. This was why humanity existed according to the Mesopotamian worldview, not as the pinnacle of creation, not as beings made in the divine image to rule over the earth, but as servants, as workers, as the solution to a divine labour dispute. It's a surprisingly pragmatic origin story, and it explains much about how the Sumerians and their successors understood their relationship with the gods. Humans were necessary, valued for their service, but ultimately subordinate, created to fulfill a need. But humanity's creation solved one problem while creating others. The Atrahasis epic continues beyond the creation story, detailing what happened as humans multiplied and spread across the earth. At first, everything seemed to be working as intended. Humans dug the canals, tended the fields, brought offerings to the temples. The gods were satisfied. The Igigi were released from their labour and presumably took their place among the other lesser deities, no longer mentioned in the myths as a separate suffering group. But humans reproduced, and they reproduced quickly. Within generations, humans had spread across Mesopotamia, building more cities, creating more noise, more activity. And this noise, according to the texts, became a problem. Enlil, who lived in the city of Nippur, found himself disturbed by the constant din of human civilization. He couldn't sleep, couldn't rest. The noise was overwhelming, a constant buzz of activity rising from the earth below. So Enlil decided to reduce the human population. The texts describe a series of disasters he sent to accomplish this. First, he sent plague, disease that swept through human communities, killing many. But Enki intervened. He advised a human named Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, to pray not to all the gods but specifically to Namtar, the god of plague, offering him special worship and sacrifice. Namtar, flattered by the attention, held back his hand and the plague subsided. Enlil tried again, this time with drought. He commanded Adad, the storm god, to withhold rain, causing crops to fail and famine to spread. Again, Atrahasis consulted with Enki, and again Enki provided a solution. Atrahasis led his people in focused worship of Adad, and Adad, like Namtar before him, was moved to mercy. The rains returned, the crops grew again, and humanity survived. This pattern repeated. Each time Enlil tried to reduce the human population, Enki found a way to thwart him, to save humanity from destruction. The relationship between these two gods, Enlil and Enki, is fascinating. They're brothers, both among the highest ranking of the Anunnaki, but they represent different approaches to cosmic order. Enlil is concerned with maintaining peace, quiet, and control. He sees humans as useful but ultimately expendable if they become too disruptive. Enki, on the other hand, seems to have a genuine fondness for humanity, or at least for individual humans like Atrahasis. He views them as his creations, beings that reflect his own cleverness and ingenuity. He's willing to bend rules, find loopholes, protect humanity even when other gods want to eliminate them. But eventually, Enlil lost patience with Enki's interference. He decided on a final solution, one that no single god could prevent, one that would require the cooperation of all the great Anunnaki. He proposed a flood, a deluge that would wipe the earth clean of humanity, allowing the gods to start over, perhaps try again with a smaller, quieter population, or perhaps give up on the human experiment entirely. The flood story appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts, and it's one of the most important myths in the entire ancient Near Eastern tradition, because it parallels so closely the biblical story of Noah and the Ark. But the Mesopotamian versions are older, much older, predating the biblical text by more than 1,000 years. The earliest Sumerian version is found in what scholars call the Eridu Genesis, or the Sumerian flood story, dating to around 1600 years before the Common Era, though likely based on even older oral traditions. In this version, the flood hero is called Ziusudra, whose name might mean life of long days, or he found life. Ziusudra was a priest-king in the city of Shuruppak, and when the gods decided to send the flood, Enki, still sympathizing with humanity, warned him through a dream, or by speaking through the wall of a reed hut, keeping technically to his oath not to directly reveal the god's plan. The text is fragmentary, with large sections missing, but the basic outline is clear. Ziusudra was told to build a boat, to seal it with bitumen, to bring aboard his family and animals. The flood came, lasting 7 days and 7 nights, and when it was over, Ziusudra offered sacrifice to the gods. The gods, particularly the goddess Inanna and the sun god Utu, were moved by his piety and granted him immortality, placing him in Dilmun, a distant paradise-like land. The Akkadian version, preserved more completely in the Atrahasis epic, gives more detail. Here the flood hero is called Atrahasis himself, the exceedingly wise human who had already survived several of Enlil's attempts to reduce humanity. When Enlil proposed the flood, he made all the gods swear an oath not to warn humanity. But Enki, clever as always, found a way around this. He didn't speak directly to Atrahasis. Instead, he spoke to Atrahasis' reed hut, ostensibly talking to himself or to the wall, loud enough that Atrahasis inside could hear every word. "Dismantle your house," Enki said to the wall. "Build a boat. Forsake possessions and save life. Make the boat equal in all directions, roof it like the Abzu so the sun cannot see inside." Atrahasis understood. He gathered the elders of Shuruppak and told them a story, a clever excuse for why he needed to leave. He claimed that Enki and Enlil had quarrelled, that Enki had commanded him to go live by the water's edge, away from Enlil's territory. The elders helped him build the boat, not realizing they were aiding in humanity's survival. Atrahasis loaded the boat with his family, animals, birds, provisions, everything he would need to survive. When Adad began to thunder, when the storm clouds gathered, Atrahasis sealed the door with bitumen from the outside and then climbed in through a hatch, sealing it behind him. The flood that followed was terrible beyond description. The texts say it was like a wild ass screaming, the winds howling, darkness total, no sun visible. Even the gods were terrified by what they had unleashed. They cowered like dogs gathered in the highest heaven, weeping at the destruction below. And here's something remarkable in the text. The gods grew hungry. Without humans to bring them offerings, to maintain their temples, to perform the daily rituals of feeding and care, the gods began to starve. They realized too late that they needed humanity as much as humanity needed them. The relationship was symbiotic, not one-directional. When the flood finally subsided, when the waters receded and land appeared again, Atrahasis sent out birds to test whether the earth was ready to be inhabited again. First a dove, which returned finding nowhere to land. Then a swallow also returning. Finally a raven, which did not return, having found food in the receding waters. Atrahasis opened the hatch, saw dry land, and climbed out onto the side of the boat, which had come to rest on a mountain. His first act was to offer sacrifice, slaughtering animals and burning them as offerings to the gods. The texts describe how the gods smelled the sweet savour of the sacrifice and gathered around it like flies, so hungry they were after the flood and the absence of human worship. Enlil arrived, furious to discover that humanity had survived, that someone had broken the oath and warned Atrahasis. He confronted Enki, but Enki defended his actions, pointing out that Enlil's solution had been too extreme, that destroying all of humanity would have meant no more worship, no more service, no more offerings. The gods needed humans, and that meant finding a better way to manage the human population than periodic genocidal floods. A compromise was reached. Humanity would be allowed to survive, to continue serving the gods, but measures would be taken to prevent overpopulation and excessive noise. Nintu, the birth goddess, instituted several innovations. Some women would be barren, unable to have children. There would be demons that stole infants, causing what we would today call infant mortality. There would be priestesses sworn to celibacy, women who never bore children. Death would come to all humans eventually, limiting each life to a set span of years rather than the incredibly long lifespans that the antediluvian humans had supposedly enjoyed. These measures would keep the population manageable, the noise tolerable, allowing gods and humans to coexist in a sustainable relationship. Atrahasis himself was granted something special. The texts are not entirely clear, but it seems he and his wife were made immortal, taken to live in a distant place beyond normal human reach. This same story appears again in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood hero is called Utnapishtim, and he tells Gilgamesh about the flood when the hero seeks the secret of eternal life. The parallels between these Mesopotamian flood stories and the biblical account in Genesis are impossible to ignore. A righteous man warned by a deity, a great boat built to specific instructions, animals saved in pairs, a flood that destroys all other life, birds sent out to test for dry land, a mountain where the boat comes to rest, sacrifice offered after the flood, a divine promise or covenant established afterward. The similarities are so striking that most scholars agree there must be a direct literary relationship, that the biblical authors knew and adapted the Mesopotamian tradition, reshaping it to fit their own monotheistic theology. But for our purposes tonight, what's important is what these stories tell us about the Anunnaki, about their relationship with humanity, about their limitations and their needs. These gods were powerful, yes, capable of creating life, of bringing devastating floods, of deciding the fates of entire civilizations, but they were not omnipotent. They made mistakes, had regrets, needed humans as much as humans needed them. They argued with each other, formed factions, held grudges, changed their minds. In many ways, the Mesopotamian gods were more like powerful but fallible rulers than the transcendent, perfect deity of later monotheistic traditions. And this brings us to a key question that has sparked intense debate in modern times. What were the Anunnaki? Were they truly divine beings, gods in the traditional sense, expressions of natural forces and cosmic principles, given personality and agency by ancient imagination? Or were they, as some theorists have suggested, something else entirely? This is where we need to talk about Zecharia Sitchin and the ancient astronaut hypothesis, because no discussion of the Anunnaki in popular culture can avoid addressing these ideas, controversial as they are. Sitchin was a Russian-born American author who studied ancient Hebrew, Sumerian, and Akkadian texts, and developed a revolutionary, though hotly contested interpretation of what these texts were really describing. In 1976, Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet, the first in a series he called the Earth Chronicles. In this work and its sequels, Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki were not mythological deities but rather extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, supposedly a massive world with an extremely long elliptical orbit that brings it close to Earth once every 3,600 years. According to Sitchin's interpretation, the Anunnaki came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago with a specific mission. They wanted to mine gold, which their planet needed, perhaps to reflect sunlight or repair their atmosphere. The details of why they needed gold varies in different tellings, but the core idea remains the same. Earth had abundant gold deposits, so the Anunnaki established a base here and began mining operations. Initially, Sitchin theorized the Anunnaki themselves did the mining work, but this was backbreaking labor, and eventually the workers rebelled. This rebellion of the Igigi, which we discussed earlier from the mythological texts, was reinterpreted by Sitchin as a labor dispute among the extraterrestrial workers. To solve this problem, the Anunnaki leaders decided to create a primitive worker, a being intelligent enough to follow instructions and perform complex tasks but not so advanced as to question or rebel. They took a primitive hominid that already existed on Earth, probably Homo erectus, and genetically modified it, adding their own DNA to create Homo sapiens, modern humans. This genetic manipulation, Sitchin argued, was what the creation stories were actually describing when they spoke of gods mixing clay with divine blood to create humans. The clay was the existing primitive hominid, the divine blood was the Anunnaki DNA, and the result was us. Humans were created in this interpretation as a slave species, workers in the gold mines, servants to the Anunnaki. Sitchin went further, connecting the Anunnaki to ancient sites around the world, suggesting they were responsible for building or inspiring the construction of monuments, like the pyramids, Stonehenge, and other megalithic structures. He interpreted ancient art and symbolism through this lens, seeing depictions of spacecraft astronauts and advanced technology in cylinder seals and relief carvings. The ancient Sumerian stories of gods descending from heaven were, in Sitchin's view, literal accounts of spacecraft landing on Earth, not metaphorical or symbolic language. His book sold millions of copies and spawned a whole genre of ancient astronaut literature and television programming. Shows like Ancient Aliens on the History Channel have popularized these ideas, presenting them to audiences around the world. But here's the thing, and this is crucial to understand. Mainstream scholars, archaeologists, historians, and experts in ancient languages almost universally reject Sitchin's interpretations. They point out numerous problems with his translations, arguing that he often mistranslated Sumerian words, took phrases out of context, or assigned meanings to terms that don't match scholarly consensus. For example, Sitchin claimed that the Sumerian word for gods, Dingir, meant those who from heaven to earth came, interpreting it as a description of space travelers. but scholars note that Dingya simply means god or deity, with no implication of physical travel from another planet. Similarly, Sitchin's planet Nibiru is controversial. There is an astronomical body called Nibiru mentioned in some Mesopotamian texts, but most scholars identify it with Jupiter, not with an unknown planet with a 3,600-year orbit. NASA has repeatedly stated that there is no scientific evidence for such a planet, and its supposed orbit would be easily detectable with modern instruments. Critics also point out that Sitchin's theory requires accepting that advanced extraterrestrials capable of interstellar travel and genetic engineering would need human slaves to mine gold, a scenario that seems technologically inconsistent. If they had the technology to travel between stars, why wouldn't they have automated mining technology? Why would they need to create a biological workforce? Despite these objections, Sitchin's ideas remain popular, and they raise interesting questions about how we interpret ancient texts. Should we always assume that ancient peoples were speaking metaphorically when they described gods coming from the sky? Could there be a kernel of historical truth beneath the mythological language? These are legitimate questions, even if Sitchin's specific answers are rejected by most experts. What we can say, with confidence, is that the ancient Sumerians and their successors genuinely believed in the Anunnaki as divine beings. The texts weren't written as science fiction, or as coded accounts of alien contact. They were religious and mythological literature, expressing the author's sincere understanding of how the cosmos worked, who created it, and why humans existed. But that doesn't mean we can't find value in examining these stories closely, in taking seriously what they tell us about ancient Mesopotamian culture, worldview, and perhaps even about events, historical or natural, that might lie behind some of the narratives. The flood stories, for instance, might reflect actual catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia's history. Archaeological evidence suggests that the region experienced several severe floods during the early Bronze Age, floods that would have been devastating to low-lying settlements. These historical events could have been incorporated into mythological frameworks, understood as divine punishment or divine will. Similarly, the creation stories reflect genuine questions about human origins and purpose. Every culture has creation myths, stories that explain where people came from and why they exist. The Mesopotamian versions are notable for their pragmatism, for their focus on humans as workers, as beings with a function to fulfill. This reflects the social organization of Mesopotamian society itself, with its complex hierarchies, division of labor, and sense that everyone had a role to play in maintaining civilization. Let's return to the texts themselves, because there's more to explore in what they actually say about the Anunnaki and their interactions with humanity. One of the most important deities in the Anunnaki pantheon was Inanna, known to the Akkadians as Ishtar. She was the goddess of love, beauty, sex, fertility, but also of war, power, and political authority, a complex, multifaceted deity who couldn't be reduced to simple categories. One of the most fascinating myths about her is called Inanna's descent to the underworld, a story that reveals much about the structure of the divine cosmos and the power dynamics among the gods. In this myth, Inanna decides to visit the underworld, the realm of the dead, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. The reasons for this visit aren't entirely clear in the text, but it seems to be motivated by Inanna's desire for greater power, to extend her dominion even into the realm of death itself. She prepares carefully, dressing in all her regalia, her crown, her jewels, her royal robes, carrying the symbols of her authority. She travels to the gates of the underworld and demands entry, but the underworld has its own rules. As Inanna passes through each of the 7 gates leading deeper into the realm of death, she is forced to remove one item of clothing or one symbol of her power. By the time she reaches the throne room of Ereshkigal, she is naked, stripped of all her divine authority. Ereshkigal and the Anunnaki, who serve as judges in the underworld, yes, the text specifically mentions the Anunnaki as judges of the dead, pass judgment on Inanna. They find her guilty of hubris, of overreaching, and they condemn her to death. Inanna is killed, her corpse hung on a hook on the wall like a piece of meat. For 3 days and 3 nights, Inanna remains dead in the underworld. Meanwhile, on earth and in heaven, everything connected to her begins to fail. Fertility stops, crops don't grow, animals don't reproduce, humans lose all interest in sex and love. The world begins to die with her. Inanna had prepared for this possibility. Before descending, she instructed her vizier, her assistant, to raise alarm if she didn't return within 3 days. The vizier does this, going to each of the great gods seeking help. Enlil refuses to help. So does Nanna, the moon god, Inanna's father. But Enki, always the clever problem solver, devises a plan. He creates 2 beings from the dirt under his fingernails, creatures that neither alive nor dead, and sends them to the underworld with the food and water of life. These creatures gain entry by mourning with Ereshkigal, who is in pain, perhaps from childbirth or from the grief of her own isolated existence in the underworld. In her gratitude for their sympathy, Ereshkigal offers them a gift, and they ask for Inanna's corpse. They sprinkle it with the food and water of life, and Inanna revives. But there's a catch. The laws of the underworld are absolute. Someone who enters cannot leave unless they provide a substitute, someone else to take their place. Inanna must find someone to send to the underworld in her stead. Inanna returns to the upper world accompanied by demons who will seize the substitute she chooses. She finds everyone mourning her except for her husband, Dumuzi, the shepherd god who is sitting on her throne, dressed in fine clothes, apparently quite comfortable with her absence. Furious at his lack of concern, Inanna points at him, and the demons drag Dumuzi to the underworld. But Dumuzi's sister, Geshtinana, loves her brother and volunteers to spend half the year in the underworld, so Dumuzi can spend half the year in the upper world. This myth serves multiple purposes in Mesopotamian culture. It explains the changing seasons, Dumuzi's descent marking the hot, dry summer when vegetation dies, his return marking the cool season when crops grow again. But it also illustrates the power and danger of the Anunnaki, their control over life and death, fertility and barrenness, the cycles of nature and civilization. Inanna is one of the most important gods, yet even she is subject to cosmic law, to rules that even the gods cannot break without consequences. This theme appears throughout Mesopotamian mythology. The gods are powerful, but they're not above divine law. The Tablet of Destinies, a mysterious artifact mentioned in several myths, seems to represent legitimate authority, cosmic law itself. Whoever possesses it has the right to command, and even the highest gods must respect it. In one myth, the Tablet of Destinies is stolen by Anzu, a lion-headed eagle, and the gods must retrieve it to restore proper order. In the Enuma Elish, Tiamat gives the tablet to Kingu, her chosen champion, granting him authority to lead her forces. When Marduk defeats them, he takes the tablet, confirming his right to rule the gods. The emphasis on legitimate authority, on rules and laws that even gods must follow, reflects the Mesopotamian worldview. This was a civilization built on law, on written codes like the famous Code of Hammurabi, on contracts and agreements, on the idea that even the powerful must operate within accepted frameworks. The gods modelled this. They weren't arbitrary tyrants doing whatever they pleased. They held councils, debated, made decisions collectively, though Enlil and later Marduk had special authority as executors of the council's will. Another important aspect of the Anunnaki myths is how they interact with human heroes and kings. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous work of ancient Mesopotamian literature, provides a perfect example. Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk, described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, suggesting one of his parents was a god, specifically his mother Ninsun, a minor goddess. The epic begins with Gilgamesh oppressing his people, overworking the men, claiming the right to sleep with brides on their wedding nights before their husbands. The people of Uruk pray to the gods for relief, and the gods respond by creating Enkidu, a wild man who lives with animals in the wilderness, to serve as a rival and match for Gilgamesh. After a confrontation that becomes a friendship, Gilgamesh and Enkidu embark on adventures together, travelling to the cedar forest to kill Humbaba, its divine guardian, and later killing the bull of heaven sent by Ishtar Inanna, when Gilgamesh rejects her romantic advances. But the gods are not pleased with these acts of hubris. They decree that one of the heroes must die as punishment. Enkidu is chosen, and he falls ill, suffering for 12 days before dying, giving him time to reflect on his life and regret that he won't die in battle but in a bed. A shameful death for a warrior. Gilgamesh is devastated by Enkidu's death, mourning his friend but also becoming terrified of his own mortality. If Enkidu, strong as any man, could die, then Gilgamesh too would eventually die. This realization sends Gilgamesh on a quest for immortality, travelling to the ends of the earth seeking Utnapishtim, the flood hero who was granted eternal life by the gods. When Gilgamesh finally finds Utnapishtim, living in a distant paradise beyond the waters of death, Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood and explains that he was granted immortality only because of unique circumstances that will never be repeated. The gods have decreed that humans must die. It's part of the order established after the flood. Immortality is not for mortals. Utnapishtim does offer Gilgamesh a chance, though. There's a plant at the bottom of the sea that can restore youth. If Gilgamesh can obtain it, he won't live forever, but he can keep returning to youth whenever he grows old. Gilgamesh dives deep, finds the plant, and begins his journey back to Uruk, planning to test the plant on an old man before using it himself. But during the return journey, when Gilgamesh stops to bathe in a pool, a serpent smells the plant, steals it, and eats it. The serpent immediately sheds its skin and slithers away renewed, which is why snakes shed their skin. According to the myth, they stole immortality from humanity. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, having failed in his quest, but he's gained wisdom. He's learned to accept mortality, to find meaning not in living forever, but in the legacy he leaves behind, in the great walls of Uruk he built, in the deeds he accomplished, in the stories that will be told about him after death. The epic ends with Gilgamesh showing the walls of Uruk to the boatmen who accompanied him, asking him to admire their strength and consider how they will endure long after Gilgamesh himself is dust. This is a very different view of the relationship between gods and humans than we see in many other mythological traditions. The Mesopotamian gods don't offer salvation or eternal life to their worshippers. They don't promise a blessed afterlife for the righteous. The underworld in Mesopotamian belief is a grim place where all the dead go, regardless of how they lived, a dusty, dark realm where spirits eat clay and drink dirty water. There's no heaven for heroes, no Valhalla for warriors, no paradise for the pure. Death is the great equalizer, and the gods have decreed it must be so. What the gods do offer is order, stability, protection in this life. If humans serve the gods properly, maintain the temples, perform the rituals, the gods will in return protect their cities from enemies, ensure good harvests, maintain the cosmic order that keeps chaos at bay. It's a pragmatic relationship, transactional, almost contractual. And when humans fail to uphold their end, when they become too noisy, too numerous, too troublesome, the gods respond with natural disasters, plagues, famines, floods. This worldview shaped how Mesopotamian society functioned. Kings ruled with divine mandate, claiming to be chosen by the gods, but they were still human, still mortal, still subject to divine judgment if they failed to rule justly. Priests maintained temples and performed rituals not out of abstract spiritual devotion, but because these acts were necessary to keep the gods satisfied and the world functioning. Common people worked the fields, dug the canals, built the walls, fulfilling the role that humanity had been created to serve, working for the gods through working for their earthly representatives, the kings and priests. It was a hierarchical system, but one with clear expectations and reciprocal obligations. Everyone knew their place, their role, their purpose. And at the top of this hierarchy, above even the kings, stood the Anunnaki, the great gods who had created everything and whose will determined the fate of cities, nations, and all living things. Understanding the Anunnaki means understanding this entire worldview, this way of seeing the cosmos as an ordered hierarchy, where everyone and everything has a proper place and function. But we haven't yet discussed the Enuma Elish in detail, and we should, because this 7-tablet epic is arguably the most important Mesopotamian creation text, the one that attempts to explain not just human origins, but the origins of the entire cosmos, the birth of the gods themselves, and how order emerged from primordial chaos. The Enuma Elish, which means when on high, the opening words of the text, was discovered in fragmentary form in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh in the 1800s. British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard found the tablets, and George Smith first translated and published them in 1876. The tablets date to around 1200 years before the Common Era, though the myth itself is certainly much older, probably originating in Sumerian sources before being adapted by the Babylonians. The epic was read aloud during the Babylonian New Year festival, the Akitu, reinforcing Marduk's supremacy and reminding the people of how their god had created the world and established order. The story begins in a time before time, when nothing existed except the primordial waters. Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water, mingled together, and from their union the first gods emerged. These first gods were Lamu and Lahamu, whose names might mean muddy or slimy, appropriate for beings born from the mixing of waters. From them came Anshar and Kishar, representing the horizon and the earth, and from them came Anu, the sky, and his son Ea, who is Enki. These younger gods were energetic, active, noisy, disturbing the peace that Apsu and Tiamat had enjoyed. Apsu complained to Tiamat, saying the noise of the young gods kept him from rest. He proposed destroying them so he and Tiamat could have peace again, but Tiamat objected. These were their children, their offspring. How could they destroy them? However, Apsu was determined. He consulted with his vizier, Mumu, and they made plans to attack the younger gods. But Ea, always clever, discovered the plot through his magical abilities. He cast a spell over Apsu, putting him into a deep sleep, and then killed him, claiming Apsu's realm, the freshwater deep, as his own. Ea built his dwelling on top of Apsu's body, establishing his home in what would become the Abzu. There, with his wife Damkina, Ea fathered a son, Marduk, who was born with exceptional qualities, double the size of other gods, with 4 eyes and 4 ears, radiating fire when he opened his mouth, perfect in every way. Tiamat, who had initially opposed destroying the younger gods, was now enraged by Apsu's murder. She created an army of monsters to avenge her consort, chimeric beings, serpents, dragons, scorpion men and other terrors. She appointed Kingu, possibly her new consort, as the leader of her forces, giving him the Tablet of Destinies to authorize his command. The young gods were terrified when they learned of Tiamat's preparations. They held a council, trying to decide what to do. Ea, who had defeated Apsu, tried to face Tiamat but turned back, afraid of her power. Anu also tried and failed. None of the gods were willing to stand against Tiamat and her monsters. Finally, Ea suggested his son Marduk. Despite his youth, Marduk was powerful, confident, strong. Marduk agreed to fight Tiamat, but he demanded something in return. He told the assembled gods that if he defeated Tiamat, if he saved them all from destruction, they must make him their king, their supreme ruler. Whatever he decreed should become law, unchangeable even by the other gods. The gods were desperate enough to agree. They held a banquet, got drunk on beer and wine, and proclaimed Marduk their champion and future king. They tested his power by having him speak a word to make a cloth disappear, then speak another word to make it reappear. When this worked, they confirmed his authority and sent him to battle Tiamat. Marduk prepared carefully. He made a bow and arrows, carried a mace, wielded lightning, and created a net of winds to ensnare his enemy. When he confronted Tiamat, they exchanged challenges and insults. Then they fought. Marduk spread his net, catching Tiamat within it. He sent winds into her mouth when she opened it to swallow him, bloating her belly. Then he shot an arrow into her distended belly, splitting her in two, killing her. Her army of monsters tried to flee, but Marduk captured them, binding them and placing them under guard. He took the Tablet of Destinies from Kingu and fastened it to his own breast, claiming the legitimate authority it represented. Then Marduk turned his attention to Tiamat's corpse. He split it in half like a shellfish. From one half, he created the sky, setting up barriers to keep the primordial waters above from flooding down. From the other half, he created the earth below. He organized the cosmos, setting the stars in their courses, establishing the paths of the planets, creating the moon to mark the months and the sun to light the days. He built dwellings for the gods in the heavens, assigning each their proper place. The gods rejoiced at what Marduk had accomplished, at how he had created order from chaos, transformed threat into cosmos, made a world where they could dwell in safety and comfort. They confirmed his kingship, granting him 50 names, each representing an aspect of his power and authority. But there was still work to be done. The gods needed servants to maintain the world Marduk had created. So Marduk proposed creating humans. He asked which god had incited Tiamat's rebellion, who had been the instigator of the war. The gods identified King as the one primarily responsible. King was brought forward and executed, his blood used to create humanity. Ea mixed the blood with clay and formed the first humans. Their purpose was explicit. They would take on the labor of the gods so the gods could rest. Humanity would maintain the temples, provide offerings, do the work of keeping the world functioning. The Enuma Elish then describes how the gods, grateful for their newfound leisure, decided to build a grand temple for Marduk in Babylon. They worked for a year, creating a Sagala, the Great Temple, and the Ziggurat-etem Ananke, whose name means House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, the ziggurat that might have inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. When this work was complete, the gods celebrated with a great banquet, praising Marduk with his 50 names, establishing his cult, confirming Babylon as the centre of the world. This myth served multiple purposes in Babylonian society. It explained the creation of the cosmos in detail, from the very beginning when nothing existed to the fully organized world with its cities and temples. It justified Marduk's supremacy over the other gods, showing how he earned his position through valor and wisdom, not merely through inherited authority. It explained why Babylon was the greatest city, because it was built by the gods themselves as Marduk's dwelling place. And it reminded humans of their purpose. They existed to serve the gods, a role they should fulfill with dedication and pride. The influence of the Enuma Elish extends far beyond ancient Mesopotamia. Scholars have noted numerous parallels between this text and the biblical book of Genesis. Both begin with primordial waters and chaos. Both describe the separation of waters above from waters below to create the sky. Both involve the creation of light, the firmament, dry land, celestial bodies, and finally humans, in roughly the same order. Both grant humans a specific role in the divine plan. The parallels are too numerous and too specific to be coincidental. Most scholars conclude that the biblical authors were familiar with Mesopotamian creation traditions and incorporated elements of them into their own creation account, adapting and transforming them to fit Israelite theology. Where the Enuma Elish has multiple gods creating the world through conflict and violence, Genesis has one god creating through speech alone. Where the Enuma Elish makes humans from the blood of a defeated enemy god, Genesis makes humans from dust but breathes divine spirit into them directly. Where the Enuma Elish presents creation as establishing order from chaos, Genesis presents creation as a completely new act of divine will. But both texts are addressing the same, the fundamental questions. Where did the world come from? Where did we come from? Why do we exist? What is our purpose? The Enuma Elish's answer is pragmatic and hierarchical. The world came from conflict resolved through strength and wisdom. Humans came from divine essence mixed with earthly matter. We exist to serve the gods, to do the work they don't want to do. Our purpose is to maintain the cosmic order through our labor and worship. It's not a comforting message in the way that promises of paradise or salvation might be, but it's honest in its own way. It doesn't pretend that life is easy or fair, or that humans are the center of the universe. It presents a worldview where everyone has a role, where that role might not be glamorous, but where fulfilling it properly keeps everything functioning. And for the ancient Mesopotamians, that was enough. They didn't need to be promised eternal life or divine favor. They needed to know their place, understand their purpose, and do their part. The Anunnaki, in this framework, were the architects and administrators of reality, the ones who had created the system and who maintained it, powerful but not distant, involved but not micromanaging, deserving of worship but also bound by divine law. This complex, nuanced view of divinity is what makes Mesopotamian mythology so fascinating. These weren't simple, one-dimensional gods representing single natural forces. They were fully realized personalities with histories, relationships, conflicts, and growth. They made mistakes and learned from them. They changed their minds, formed alliances, broke oaths, showed mercy, and dispensed punishment. They were, in many ways, projections of human society onto the cosmic scale, divine versions of the kings, priests, warriors, and workers who made up Mesopotamian civilization. And perhaps that's the real point. The myths weren't meant to be scientific explanations in the modern sense. They were sophisticated ways of thinking about big questions, of organizing knowledge, of transmitting cultural values, of justifying social structures, of finding meaning in a world that often seemed chaotic and arbitrary. The Anunnaki gave the Mesopotamians a framework for understanding their place in the cosmos, and that framework helped them build one of the world's first great civilizations. The sophistication of Mesopotamian theological thought becomes even more apparent when we consider how they handled contradictions and multiple traditions. Different cities had different versions of myths. Eridu might tell a story one way, emphasizing Enki's role, while Nippur's version emphasized Enlil's importance. Rather than seeing these as contradictions that needed resolving, Mesopotamian scholars preserved multiple versions, recognizing that truth could be expressed in different ways. This pluralistic approach to religious narrative is quite modern in some respects, acknowledging that divine reality might be too complex to be captured in a single, authoritative version. The scribal schools, where young men trained to become professional writers and record keepers, taught students to copy and study all the major mythological texts, regardless of which city's tradition they represented. This created a shared cultural literacy across Mesopotamia, a common pool of stories and characters that everyone understood, even if they emphasized different aspects depending on local traditions. The concept of divine hierarchy in Mesopotamian thought deserves more attention because it shaped not just religion but political theory as well. The Anunnaki weren't all equal. Anu stood at the top as the father of gods, though his practical power was often limited, serving more as a legitimizing authority than as an active ruler. Beneath him, Enlil wielded executive authority, making decisions and ensuring they were carried out. Enki, despite being Enlil's brother and equally high-ranking, often operated semi-independently, sometimes at cross-purposes with Enlil, yet both acknowledged Anu's ultimate authority. This mirrors earthly political structures where there might be a king or emperor, who held theoretical supreme power but delegated actual governance to ministers and officials who might have their own power bases and interests. The lesser gods, including the Agigi before their rebellion, occupied positions similar to administrators, governors, priests in human society, essential to the functioning of the system but subordinate to the great gods. This divine hierarchy justified and reflected earthly hierarchies. Kings ruled by divine mandate chosen by the great gods, but they were not themselves divine in the same way Egyptian pharaohs claimed to be. Mesopotamian kings were intermediaries, special humans elevated above others, but still fundamentally human, still mortal, still subject to divine judgment. This is why royal inscriptions are so careful to attribute successes to divine favour, and why kings spent enormous resources on temple construction and maintenance. They were proving their worthiness to the gods and to their human subjects. When a king claimed to have received the throne from Enlil's hands, or to have been chosen by Inanna as her special favourite, this wasn't empty boasting. It was a fundamental assertion of political legitimacy, recognising that earthly power derived from and depended on divine approval. The temple economy, which we touched on briefly, was integral to how Mesopotamian society functioned, and understanding it helps us appreciate what the Anunnaki meant in practical everyday terms. Temples were not just religious institutions, they were economic powerhouses, landowners, employers, banks, distributors of aid during famines, organisers of public works. The Temple of Enlil at Nippur, for instance, owned thousands of hectares of agricultural land, employed hundreds of workers including farmers, shepherds, fishermen, bakers, brewers, weavers, craftsmen of all kinds, maintained huge storehouses of grain and other goods, and engaged in long-distance trade. The temple's economic activities were understood as serving the god, yes, but they also served the community, redistributing wealth, providing employment, ensuring food security, funding education through the scribal schools attached to temples. The daily rituals performed for the gods, which might seem like mere ceremony to us, had profound economic and social significance. When priests offered elaborate meals to divine statues, those meals were afterwards distributed to temple personnel as their wages or rations. The production of these offerings supported farmers, butchers, bakers, brewers, and many others. The fine textiles used to dress divine statues kept weavers employed. The incense and oils used in rituals created markets for traders who brought these goods from distant lands. The Anunnaki, in this sense, were the focus around which much of the economy organised itself. Serving the gods meant, in practical terms, participating in a complex economic system that supported specialised labour, trade, and cultural production. Let me talk more about the astronomical connections because the Mesopotamians were keen observers of the heavens, and they associated the great gods with specific celestial bodies and phenomena. Anu was identified with the entire northern sky, the stars of the equatorial region representing his domain. Enlil was associated with the northern stars, Enki with the southern stars. Specific major deities had planetary identifications. Inanna was Venus, the morning and evening star, and this association shaped how she was understood. Venus as the morning star represented Inanna in her warrior aspect, bright and fierce as warriors marching to battle at dawn. Venus as the evening star represented her in her aspect as goddess of love and sexuality, the star under which lovers met. Utu was naturally the sun, his daily journey across the sky representing his oversight of human affairs, particularly justice, since nothing could be hidden from the sun's all-seeing eye. Nanna was the moon, his monthly cycle from new to full to new, again representing death and rebirth, his light providing illumination during the night when the sun god rested. These weren't arbitrary associations. The Mesopotamians developed sophisticated astronomy, tracking planetary movements, predicting eclipses, calculating the length of the year with remarkable accuracy. They created the zodiac, dividing the ecliptic into 12 sections, though their zodiac was somewhat different from the one we use today. They understood the planets as wandering stars, distinct from the fixed stars, and they tracked their movements through the constellations with careful records spanning centuries. This astronomical knowledge was put to use in astrology, which the Mesopotamians invented. They believed the gods communicated their will through celestial signs, that planetary movements, eclipses, unusual phenomena in the sky all carried meaning about earthly events. This wasn't superstition in the way we might think of it. It was a sophisticated system of interpretation based on careful observation and record-keeping. When a particular celestial configuration had preceded a certain type of event in the past, they believed it would signal the same type of event in the future. They compiled vast omen texts, cataloguing thousands of celestial observations and their associated meanings. The series called Enuma Anu Enlil, which means when An and Enlil, consisted of 70 tablets containing thousands of omens related to celestial phenomena. This shows the importance of the gods not just as mythological figures, but as active presences whose movements and signs needed to be tracked and interpreted. The king employed specialists, diviner priests, who studied these omens and advised on auspicious times for important actions. Should we wage war? Check the omens. Should we begin building a new temple? Check the omens. Should the king marry? Check the omens. This integration of astronomy, astrology, and practical decision-making shows how deeply the Anunnaki were woven into every aspect of Mesopotamian life. They weren't just stories told at festivals. They were daily presences, communicating through the movements of celestial bodies, through dreams, through natural phenomena, through the outcomes of events. We should also talk about the practical aspects of worshipping the Anunnaki, because understanding what people actually did, the rituals and practices, helps us understand what these gods meant to them. Each major city in Mesopotamia had a patron deity among the Anunnaki. Eridu had Enki, Uruk had both An and Inanna, Nippur had Enlil, Ur had Nanna, the moon god. Each city built massive temples, ziggurats, for their patron god. These weren't just ceremonial structures. They were thought to be the actual dwelling places of the gods. The temples had inner sanctuaries where the god's statue resided, rooms where priests could attend to the god's needs. Each day, priests would perform rituals for the deity. They would wake the god symbolically by singing hymns. They would bathe and dress the statue, putting fine clothes on it. They would offer food, elaborate meals prepared in temple kitchens, placed before the statue as if the god would physically eat them. After a suitable time, the food would be removed and distributed among the priests and temple workers, blessed by having been in the god's presence. The temples were enormous economic enterprises. They owned vast lands, employed hundreds or thousands of workers, maintained granaries and workshops, engaged in trade. The Temple of Enlil in Nippur, for instance, was probably the wealthiest institution in all of Sumer, receiving tribute from cities throughout Mesopotamia. The priests who served in these temples were educated elites, men who had spent years in scribal, schools learning to read and write cuneiform, studying mathematics and astronomy, memorizing hymns and rituals. The high priest of a major temple was one of the most powerful people in the city, sometimes rivaling the king in influence. Ordinary people couldn't enter the inner sanctuaries of the temples. Those areas were restricted to priests. But people could offer prayers at outer courts, leave votive offerings, Small clay statues or inscribed tablets asking the gods for help with specific problems. If someone was sick, they might pray to Ninurta, a healing god. If someone was going on a journey, they might pray to Utu, the sun god who protected travellers. If someone was in love, they might pray to Inanna. If someone was in legal trouble, they might pray to Shamash, the god of justice. There were also professional diviners who would interpret omens to discern the will of the gods. If the gods were displeased, special rituals could be performed to appease them. If the gods favoured a particular course of action, that could guide decisions about when to plant crops, when to wage war, when to build or renovate structures. The king himself was seen as the intermediary between the gods and the people. He was chosen by the gods, given authority by them, responsible to them. Royal inscriptions often begin with formulas like, "When Enlil gave me kingship," or "By the command of Inanna, I accomplished these deeds." The king's main duties were to maintain the temples, expand them when possible, perform the most important religious ceremonies, and ensure justice and prosperity for the people, because that was what the gods expected of their chosen ruler. When a king failed, when crops failed, or enemies invaded or plague struck, this was interpreted as the gods withdrawing their favour, punishing the king for some offence. But daily worship wasn't just grand temple rituals performed by priests. Ordinary people had their own religious practices, their own ways of connecting with the divine. Most homes had small shrines, niches in walls where figurines of household gods were kept. These were usually minor deities, personal protective spirits, or ancestral figures, but people understood them as connected to the greater Anunnaki, part of the same divine cosmos. Prayers might be offered at these home shrines before important family events, before journeys, during illness, at times of transition like weddings or childbirth. Amulets and protective inscriptions were common. Small objects inscribed with prayers or divine names meant to ward off evil spirits or bring divine protection. These weren't seen as magical in the sense of manipulating supernatural forces against the god's will. Rather, they were ways of invoking divine protection, of connecting with the Anunnaki's power in everyday life. There was also divination through dreams. Many myths describe gods communicating with humans through dreams, and this was considered a legitimate form of divine communication. Dreams were taken seriously, analysed for symbolic meaning, used to guide important decisions. Temple incubation was practiced, where someone would sleep in a temple hoping to receive a dream from the god. We also know about festivals, times when the entire city would participate in religious ceremonies. The New Year festival in Babylon, when the Enuma Elish was recited, included processions, sacrifices, ritual dramas reenacting Marduk's victory over Tiamat. The sacred marriage ritual performed in various cities involved the king ritually marrying Inanna, a ceremony meant to ensure fertility for the coming year, though scholars debate whether this was purely symbolic or involved actual sexual activity. The ritual year was structured around the agricultural cycle because fundamentally, the Anunnaki were understood as controlling the forces of nature. Planting time, harvest time, the flooding season, all these required divine blessing. Festivals mark these transitions with offerings, prayers, and rituals designed to secure the gods' favour for the coming season. When we think about what it meant to worship the Anunnaki, we need to imagine not just occasional visits to temples, but a life thoroughly infused with religious consciousness. The gods were present in the movements of sun, moon, and stars. They were present in the flooding of rivers, the growth of crops, the health of livestock. They spoke through dreams, omens, unusual events. They blessed successful ventures and punished transgressions. They were, in every meaningful sense, the fundamental reality that structured existence. Let's also consider the ethical dimensions of Anunnaki worship, because this is often overlooked when people focus just on the mythological narratives. The Mesopotamians believed the gods demanded justice, truth, and proper conduct from humans, especially from kings and leaders. Multiple hymns and prayers emphasize this. Shamash, the sun god, was particularly associated with justice, and kings were expected to uphold justice as Shamash's representatives on earth. The famous law code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest comprehensive legal codes in history, begins with Hammurabi stating that Anu and Enlil named him to promote the welfare of the people, to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and evil, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. This wasn't just political rhetoric. It reflected a genuine belief that the gods required rulers to provide justice, protect the vulnerable, maintain social order. This ethical dimension extended beyond rules about crimes and punishments. The Mesopotamians believed in a concept sometimes called misfortune or sin, not in the later Christian sense of moral failing, but more like ritual impurity or having offended the gods, often unknowingly. If someone suffered misfortune, illness, loss, this might be interpreted as indicating they had somehow displeased the gods. But rather than accepting this, fatalistically they believed it could be remedied through ritual cleansing, prayers, offerings, consulting with priests who could identify what offence had been committed and how to make amends. This system, while it could be abused by corrupt priests, also provided people with agency, with ways to respond to suffering rather than just accepting it passively. It said that your relationship with the gods mattered, that your actions had consequences, that there were ways to restore harmony when it had been disrupted. The Mesopotamians also had wisdom literature, texts that taught proper conduct and gave advice for living well. The instructions of Shurupak, one of the oldest examples dating to the mid-3rd millennium before the Common Era, gives advice from a father to his son about how to live successfully. Much of it is practical, about working hard, being careful in business dealings, choosing friends wisely. But it's framed within the understanding that the gods have established a proper order for human society, and living well means conforming to that order. Similarly, proverbs and wise sayings often reference the gods, reminding people that divine order underlies social order, that wisdom means understanding one's proper place and role. This brings us to an important point about the Mesopotamian worldview. Unlike later monotheistic traditions that often emphasized individual salvation, personal relationship with deity, and eternal reward or punishment based on moral choices, Mesopotamian religion was primarily concerned with maintaining cosmic and social order in this life. The gods weren't waiting to judge your soul after death and assign you to heaven or hell. The underworld was the same for everyone, a grim place regardless of how you'd lived. What mattered was this life, your contribution to social order, your fulfillment of proper roles, your participation in the rituals that maintained cosmic balance. Virtue wasn't about achieving personal salvation, but about being a proper member of society, fulfilling duties to family, city, king, and gods. This might seem less spiritually elevated than religions promising eternal salvation, but it had its own profound insights. It emphasized communal responsibility over individual achievement. It recognized that human meaning comes through participation in something larger than oneself. It grounded ethics in practical social needs rather than abstract principles, and it was remarkably successful, sustaining one of the world's longest-lasting continuous civilizations. The system worked, not perfectly, but well enough that it endured for 3,000 years, adapting to conquests, incorporating new peoples and ideas, yet maintaining core principles about divine order, human purpose, and the structure of cosmos and society. Now let's examine more closely how the Anunnaki myths shaped political legitimacy and power, because this is crucial to understanding their role in Mesopotamian civilization. When a new king came to power, whether through inheritance, conquest, or political maneuvering, he needed to establish legitimacy, to prove he had the right to rule. This wasn't just a matter of having the most soldiers or the strongest army. It required divine sanction, recognition by the great gods that this person was their chosen ruler. Royal inscriptions are full of formulas establishing this divine choice. A typical inscription might begin, "When Anu and Enlil looked favourably upon me, when Inanna chose me from among all men, when Enki granted me wisdom, then I was made king over Sumer and Akkad." This isn't metaphor or poetic flourish. These kings genuinely believed, and wanted their subjects to believe, that their rule was ordained by the Anunnaki. How was this divine choice manifested? Through omens, primarily. Before a king ascended to the throne, diviners would examine the organs of sacrificed animals, observe celestial phenomena, interpret dreams, looking for signs that the gods approved of this candidate. If the omens were favourable, this was understood as divine confirmation. If unfavourable, another candidate might be sought, or special rituals performed to secure divine favour. Once crowned, the king's success or failure was interpreted through the same lens. Military victories proved the gods favoured him. Good harvests showed divine blessing, but defeats, famines, natural disasters, these suggested the gods were displeased that the king had somehow failed in his duties. This system created accountability of a sort. A king couldn't simply do whatever he wanted and expect to remain in power indefinitely. He needed to maintain the favour of the priests who claimed to interpret divine will. He needed to fund temples, maintain rituals, provide justice, protect the weak, defeat enemies, ensure prosperity. If he failed at these duties, it could be claimed the gods had withdrawn their favour, providing justification for rebellion or replacement. The Anunnaki, in this way, were tools of political legitimacy but also of political resistance. An oppressive king could be challenged by priests claiming the gods were displeased. A weak king could be replaced by someone claiming superior divine favour. The ziggurat construction projects that dominated many Mesopotamian cities were partly about this political religious dynamic. Building a ziggurat was an enormous undertaking, requiring organisation of thousands of workers, massive resources, years or decades of sustained effort. A king who could complete such a project proved his organisational ability, his wealth, his favour with the gods, since surely the gods wouldn't allow such an undertaking to succeed unless they approved of the king. The ziggurats were propaganda, certainly, but they were also genuine expressions of faith, attempts to provide fitting homes for the gods who protected the city, and they were economic engines, employing workers, training craftsmen, creating demand for materials and labour. Think about what it meant for a city to have a massive ziggurat at its centre, visible from miles away, dominating the skyline. It said, "We are powerful, we are organised, we have divine favour. Our God lives here, in this magnificent structure. Come worship here, trade with us, fear our God's power, join our city under our God's protection." The ziggurat was architecture, religion, politics, economics, all combined. It was the physical manifestation of the Anunnaki's presence and power, and by extension, of the king's legitimacy and the city's importance. There was also divination through dreams. Many myths describe gods communicating with humans through dreams, and this was considered a legitimate form of divine communication. Dreams were taken seriously, analysed for symbolic meaning, used to guide important decisions. Temple incubation was practiced, where someone would sleep in a temple hoping to receive a dream from the god. We also know about festivals, times when the entire city would participate in religious ceremonies. The New Year festival in Babylon, when the Enuma Elish was recited, included processions, sacrifices, ritual dramas reenacting Marduk's victory over Tiamat. The sacred marriage ritual, performed in various cities, involved the king ritually marrying Inanna, a ceremony meant to ensure fertility for the coming year, though scholars debate whether this was purely symbolic or involved actual sexual activity. These practices show that the Anunnaki weren't abstract theological concepts to the Mesopotamians. They were living presences, beings who needed to be fed, housed, pleased, consulted. The relationship between humans and gods was intimate, immediate, practical. You didn't worship the gods because of faith or hope of salvation. You worshipped them because they were there, because they had power over your life, because maintaining good relations with them was essential to your survival and prosperity. This practical, almost business-like approach to religion might seem strange to modern sensibilities, especially if you're familiar with religions that emphasize personal spirituality, salvation, faith, and love. But it made perfect sense in the Mesopotamian context. Life was precarious, dependent on factors beyond individual control. The rivers might flood or might run dry, invaders might come, disease might strike. Having powerful protectors, even if those protectors demanded service and worship in return, was better than facing the chaos alone. As Mesopotamian civilization evolved, so did the understanding of the Anunnaki. In earlier Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki were primarily associated with Earth, and sometimes with the underworld. Later, particularly in Akkadian and Babylonian sources, a distinction emerged between the Anunnaki and another group called the Igigi, though as we discussed earlier, this distinction wasn't always consistent. Sometimes the Igigi were portrayed as younger gods who served the Anunnaki. Sometimes they were associated with the heavens, while the Anunnaki were associated with Earth and the underworld. Sometimes the terms were used almost interchangeably. In Inanna's descent to the underworld, The text mentions 7 Anunnaki who serve as judges in the realm of death, determining the fates of the deceased. This role as judges, as arbiters of destiny, appears in multiple texts. The Anunnaki weren't just creators and rulers. They were also the ones who decided what would happen, who would live and die, who would prosper and suffer. The concept of fate, of predetermined destiny, was important in Mesopotamian thought. The Tablet of Destinies that we mentioned earlier represented this cosmic decree. The gods themselves operated within a framework of fate, though the highest gods had more ability to shape it than lesser deities or humans. Humans had very little control over their destinies. They were subject to the will of the gods, the decrees of fate, the unpredictable forces of nature. This might seem fatalistic, even depressing, but it also provided a way to make sense of suffering and injustice. If something bad happened, it wasn't random. It was the will of the gods, part of the cosmic order. You might not understand why the gods decreed it, but you could accept that there was a reason, a purpose, even if hidden from human understanding. This worldview persisted throughout Mesopotamian history, from the earlier Sumerian city-states through the Akkadian Empire, the Ur-III dynasty, the Old Babylonian period, the Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, right up until the conquest by Persia and the subsequent Hellenization of the region under Alexander the Great and his successors. When we look at the entire span of Mesopotamian civilization, from roughly 4000 before the Common Era to the time of Christ, we're talking about a cultural continuity that lasted longer than the time from Christ to now. That's extraordinary. And throughout that immense span of time, the Anunnaki remained central to religious thought, even as specific details changed, even as some gods rose in importance while others faded, even as new empires conquered old ones and imposed new political structures. The myths evolved, were rewritten, adapted to new contexts. When Babylon became dominant, Marduk was elevated above the other gods. But this was done by rewriting creation myths to give him the starring role, not by rejecting the earlier gods entirely. When Assyria held power, their national god Ashur was given Enlil's attributes and authority, but again, this was incorporation and adaptation, not wholesale replacement. The underlying framework remained constant. The gods, the Anunnaki, had created the world and humanity. They determined fate. They required service and worship. They maintained cosmic order, and human survival depended on maintaining proper relationships with them. This continuity influenced neighbouring cultures. The Hurrians and Hittites in Anatolia adopted Mesopotamian gods and myths, adapting them to their own languages and contexts. The Canaanites, including the Phoenicians and the peoples who had become the Israelites, knew Mesopotamian myths and were influenced by them, even as they developed their own distinct religious traditions. Egypt, though it had its own ancient and sophisticated mythology, wasn't immune to Mesopotamian influence, especially during periods of increased contact and trade. The Persian Empire, when it conquered Mesopotamia, allowed local religious traditions to continue, and some Mesopotamian deities were incorporated into Persian religious thought. Later, Hellenistic culture brought Greek philosophical and religious ideas to Mesopotamia, creating syncretic traditions that blended Greek and Mesopotamian elements. But even then, even under Hellenization, the old gods weren't completely forgotten. Temples continued to function. Cuneiform texts continued to be written and copied, though increasingly Greek and Aramaic replaced them as the primary written languages. The last cuneiform text we know of was written in the 1st century of the Common Era, sometime after the birth of Christ. It was an astronomical text, continuing the tradition of Mesopotamian astronomy and astrology that had developed over millennia. After that, the knowledge of how to read cuneiform was lost. The clay tablets that preserved Mesopotamian literature were buried, forgotten, waiting to be rediscovered in the 19th century, when archaeology became a scientific discipline. When those tablets were finally excavated, translated, published, they revealed a world that had been lost for nearly 2,000 years. They showed us that many biblical stories had Mesopotamian precursors. They demonstrated that the ancient Mesopotamians had sophisticated literature, complex theology, advanced mathematics and astronomy, detailed legal codes. They gave us the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis, Inanna's Descent, and dozens of other myths and legends, and they introduced the modern world to the Anunnaki. these gods from the ancient past who had shaped one of humanity's first great civilizations. Today, the Anunnaki exist in multiple contexts. To scholars, they're important subjects of study, windows into ancient Near Eastern religion, culture, and thought. To enthusiasts of ancient astronaut theories, they're evidence of extraterrestrial contact in humanity's distant past. To modern spiritual seekers, they're archetypal forces, psychological symbols, or even actual entities that can still be worked with through ritual and meditation. To the general public, they're exotic elements of ancient mythology, names that sound mysterious and powerful. Each of these perspectives sees something different in the Anunnaki, and in some ways, each captures a different aspect of what these gods represented to the people who worshipped them. The scholarly approach gives us historical and cultural context, helping us understand what the ancient texts actually say and what they meant to the people who wrote them. The alternative theories, even when their specific claims are dubious, highlight the fact that these myths grapple with profound questions about human origins and purpose. The spiritual interpretations recognize that the Anunnaki represent powerful archetypes, psychological forces that still resonate today, and the popular fascination demonstrates that these stories still capture imagination, still speak to something deep in human consciousness. What can we conclude from all this? What do the Sumerian texts actually reveal about what happened when the Anunnaki came to Earth? If we take the texts at face value, as the ancient Mesopotamians intended them, they reveal a complex mythology of creation, order, purpose, and relationship between divine and human. They show us gods who are powerful but not omnipotent, who create but also need what they create, who judge but are also subject to cosmic law. They show us humanity created with a specific purpose, servants of the gods, workers who maintain the cosmic order through their labor and worship. They show us disasters, floods, plagues, sent by gods who are sometimes angry at humanity's noise and disruption, but also gods who can be merciful, who protect individual humans, who need humanity as much as humanity needs them. They show us heroes and kings who interact directly with gods, who receive divine blessings and divine punishments, who serve as intermediaries between the divine and human realms. If we approach the texts as containing possible kernels of historical truth encoded in mythological language, we might see memories of real events, catastrophic floods, migrations of peoples, the development of agriculture and civilization preserved in story form. The creation myths might reflect the transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural societies, from nomadic to settled life. The flood stories might preserve memory of actual destructive floods in Mesopotamia's history. The gods themselves might represent real leaders, kings, priests, or shamans, whose deeds were magnified over time into divine status. If we entertain the ancient astronaut hypothesis, as controversial as it is, we see these myths as describing actual contact with extraterrestrial beings, interpreted through the conceptual framework available to ancient peoples. The descent from heaven becomes a literal spacecraft landing. The creation of humanity becomes genetic engineering. The gods' need for human labor becomes mining operations. The tablet of destinies becomes advanced technology. But whether we read these texts literally, metaphorically, historically, or speculatively, they remain powerful stories that have shaped human thought for millennia. They influenced later religious traditions, including Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They provide insight into how ancient peoples understood existence, morality, purpose, and relationship with the divine. The Anunnaki, as presented in these texts, are not simple figures. They're not pure good or pure evil. They're not all-powerful or all-knowing. They're complex, multifaceted, operating within systems of cosmic law even as they shape the world. They create humanity not out of love but out of need, yet individual gods like Enki show compassion for human suffering. They send the flood to destroy humanity, yet they spare one righteous family to preserve the species. They demand worship and service, yet they provide protection and order in return. This complexity is what makes them enduringly interesting. They're not cardboard cutout deities existing to teach simple moral lessons. They're fully realized beings whose stories explore deep philosophical and theological questions. What is the relationship between creator and created? Between power and responsibility? Between individual will and cosmic order? Between justice and mercy? Between mortality and immortality? The Mesopotamians grappled with these questions in their myths, and their answers, preserved in clay tablets for thousands of years, still speak to us today. They remind us that humans have always asked big questions, have always sought to understand where they came from and why they exist. They remind us that civilization is built not just through technology and organization, but through stories, through shared narratives that give meaning to collective existence. The Anunnaki were the Mesopotamians' answer to the mystery of existence. They were the names and faces they gave to the forces that shaped their world. Whether we understand those forces as literal gods, as natural phenomena personified, as psychological archetypes, as distant memories of historical events, or as something else entirely, the stories remain powerful, remain relevant, remain worth studying and contemplating. So what happened when the Anunnaki came to Earth? According to the texts, they brought order from chaos. They created the world, organized the cosmos, established cities, invented agriculture, crafted humanity itself. They gave humans purpose, even if that purpose was service and labor. They provided a framework for understanding existence, for relating to powers greater than ourselves, for finding meaning in work and worship. They judged the dead, decided fates, sent disasters and blessings, maintained the delicate balance between chaos and order. They were, in short, the foundation of Mesopotamian civilization, the divine architects whose will shaped everything. And when we read these texts today, when we study the cuneiform tablets that preserve these stories, we're connecting with that ancient world view, seeing through the eyes of people who lived thousands of years ago, but who grappled with the same fundamental questions we still face. Where do we come from? Why are we here? What is our purpose? How should we relate to forces greater than ourselves? How do we find meaning in a world that often seems chaotic and unjust? Let's delve deeper into Mesopotamian cosmology, because understanding how they envisioned the structure of the universe helps clarify the Anunnaki's role within it. The Mesopotamians conceived of the cosmos as having three main levels. The heavens above, where the greater gods like Anu dwelt, was the highest realm, a place of divine splendor and power, where the stars moved in their ordained paths and where the fate of the world was decided in divine assemblies. Below that was the earth, the middle realm, where humans, animals and plants lived, where cities rose and fell, where the drama of mortal existence played out. This earthly realm was understood as floating on or above the Apsu, the freshwater ocean that surrounded and underlay everything, the domain of Enki. And beneath all this was the underworld, the realm of the dead, ruled by Ereshkigal and her consort Nergal, a dark place of dust and shadow where all humans eventually went, regardless of their status in life or the quality of their character. The heavens weren't just an empty expanse, they were structured, organized, divided into regions associated with different gods. The path of the sun, moon, and planets across the sky marked important divisions. The fixed stars were grouped into constellations that the Mesopotamians named and tracked carefully. Some of these constellation names have come down to us, modified through Greek translations as parts of our modern zodiac. The bull of heaven that Inanna and Gilgamesh killed in the epic became our constellation Taurus. The scales that represented divine justice became our Libra. The scorpion that guarded the eastern mountains became Scorpio. This careful observation and categorization of the heavens wasn't just astronomy for its own sake, it was theology, understanding the movements and positions of divine beings and discerning their will for earthly affairs. The earth itself, in Mesopotamian understanding, was a flat disk surrounded by cosmic waters. Mountains ringed its edges where the sky touched down, forming the horizon. These mountains were especially important in mythology, as places where earth and heaven met, where gods might descend or heroes might ascend. Specific mountains had mythological significance. Mount Mashu in the Gilgamesh epic was where the sun rose and set, guarded by scorpion people. The Cedar Mountain, where Gilgamesh travelled to kill Humbaba, represented the actual Lebanon mountains, sources of precious cedar wood but also mysterious distant places where gods dwelt. The idea that mountains were especially sacred, closer to heaven, places where earth and divine realm intersected, is found in many religions and certainly characterized Mesopotamian thought. This is one reason Zigguratis, architectural mountain, an artificial peak on the flat Mesopotamian plain where a god could dwell, and where heaven and Earth could meet. The Apsu, the freshwater deep beneath and around the Earth, was understood as the source of all life-giving water. The Mesopotamians knew that freshwater came from underground sources, from springs and wells. They correctly understood that rivers ultimately derived their water from rain and snow in distant mountains, but they also knew that groundwater existed everywhere beneath the surface. This aquifer, this underground ocean, was the Apsu, and Enki ruled it, making him essential to life itself. Without the Apsu's waters, crops couldn't grow, animals couldn't drink, humans couldn't survive. Enki's control over this realm made him one of the most important gods, despite his sometimes subordinate position to Enlil in the divine hierarchy. You could displease Enlil and suffer storms or political misfortune, but if you displeased Enki, the very waters of life might be withheld. The underworld was less well defined in Mesopotamian texts, perhaps deliberately so, as a place of mystery and dread. It was entered through gates, 7 of them according to Inanna's descent, each guarded, each representing progressive removal from life and light. Once in the underworld, the dead existed as shadows, shades, ghosts called Gidim, who ate clay and drank dirty water, dwelling in darkness and dust. There was no concept of judgment determining different afterlives for the righteous versus the wicked. All went to the same place. What differentiated the dead was primarily whether they received proper burial and whether living relatives performed memorial offerings for them. A ghost who received offerings, who was remembered and honoured, might exist in relative comfort in the underworld. A ghost who was forgotten, or worse, who had died violently or without proper burial, might become a dangerous spirit returning to haunt the living. This cosmology shaped how Mesopotamians understood the Anunnaki's roles. The gods weren't removed from the physical cosmos but were integral parts of it. Anu was the heavens, Enlil was the air, the space between heaven and earth, Enki was the waters below, Ereshkigal was the underworld, Utu was literally the sun, travelling across the sky each day and through the underworld each night, which is why he knew all secrets and could judge fairly, having seen everything in both realms. These weren't just symbolic associations. In Mesopotamian thought, the god and the natural phenomenon were intimately connected, perhaps even identified. To experience the sun's heat was to experience Utu's presence. To feel rain was to receive Adad's blessing or punishment. To watch stars move across the sky was to observe the Anunnaki's activities in the heavens. This meant that understanding the natural world was simultaneously understanding the divine world. Studying astronomy was studying the movements of gods. Understanding weather patterns was understanding divine moods and intentions. Learning to predict the flooding of rivers was learning to interpret when Enki would release or withhold his waters. Science and religion weren't separate categories in Mesopotamian thought as they often are for us. Natural philosophy was theological philosophy and vice versa. The priest who studied celestial omens was also an astronomer. The diviner who examined animal entrails was also, in a sense, a biologist, understanding bodily structures and looking for anomalies that might indicate divine communication. Knowledge of the natural world was knowledge of the divine will, because nature was the gods' domain and under their direct control. Now let's return to the personalities of specific Anunnaki, because these gods weren't abstract forces, but had distinct characters that shaped how they were worshipped and how myths about them developed. Enki, for instance, is perhaps the most interesting major god because he's so consistently portrayed as clever, tricky, sometimes subversive of divine order even while being part of it. In myth after myth, when there's a problem, when the other gods don't know what to do, Enki devises a solution. When the Igigi rebel, Enki proposes creating humans. When Enlil wants to destroy humanity with plague and famine, Enki finds ways to save them. When Enlil sends the flood, Enki warns Atrahasis, finding a loophole in his oath. Enki is the god who thinks outside the box, who bends rules without quite breaking them, who values cleverness and ingenuity over brute force or strict adherence to authority. This characterization of Enki might reflect his cult's position. Eridu, his city, was the oldest Sumerian city but not always the most powerful politically. Enki was one of the highest-ranking gods, but often played second fiddle to Enlil in practical matters. His cleverness might be how a cult with less raw power maintained its prestige and importance. If you can't dominate through force, dominate through intelligence. Enki is also associated with magic, incantations, secret knowledge. The priests of Enki claimed special wisdom, special access to divine secrets, special ability to solve problems through knowledge rather than power. This made the cult attractive to scribes, scholars, anyone who valued intelligence over strength. Many of the myths we have were probably written or compiled by scribes with Enki sympathies, which might explain why he's portrayed so favourably as humanity's protector and benefactor. Enlil, in contrast, is often portrayed as stern, authoritarian, concerned with maintaining order and hierarchy. He's the god who punishes transgression, who enforces divine law, who decides when humanity has become too troublesome and needs to be reduced in number or destroyed entirely. But he's not portrayed as evil or arbitrary. His concerns are legitimate from the divine perspective. How can the gods maintain cosmic order if the beings they created keep disrupting that order? How can the gods rest if humanity's noise is constant? Enlil represents necessary authority, the principle that order requires enforcement, that boundaries must be maintained, that sometimes harsh measures are needed to preserve overall stability. His conflicts with Enki represent a fundamental tension in any ordered system between authority that maintains structure and creativity that introduces flexibility, between law that provides predictability and cleverness that finds new solutions. Inanna, Ishtar in Akkadian, is perhaps the most complex major deity because she combines so many seemingly contradictory aspects. She's the goddess of love, sexuality, fertility, beauty, but also of war, political power and destruction. She's passionate, impulsive, vain, powerful, dangerous and irresistible. Myths about her show both her allure and her peril. When Gilgamesh rejects her sexual advances, she responds by sending the Bull of Heaven to destroy Uruk, killing hundreds. When she descends to the underworld, all fertility on earth ceases, showing her essential role in life. But when she returns, she condemns her own husband to the underworld in her place, showing her capacity for harsh judgment. Inanna doesn't fit into neat categories of good or evil, nurturing or destructive. She embodies passion in all its forms, the life force that creates but also consumes, the desire that can build or destroy. Inanna's cult was extremely popular throughout Mesopotamian history, perhaps because she represented aspects of human experience that other gods didn't address as directly. Enlil was about cosmic order, Enki about wisdom and problem-solving, but Inanna was about passion, desire, the intensely personal experiences of love and combat, sexuality and violence. Her temples included priestesses who engaged in sacred prostitution, understood not as degrading but as honouring the goddess, participating in her power to create life through sexuality. This practice is controversial and debated among scholars, with some questioning whether it was as widespread as ancient sources suggest, but it clearly existed in some form and reflected a theology that saw sexuality as sacred, as one of the goddess's gifts to humanity. Nanna, the moon god, also called Sin in Akkadian, had a different character entirely. He was wise, elderly, the father of Inanna and Utu, associated with timekeeping since the moon's phases marked the months. His cult centered in Ur and had enormous prestige and wealth. The last kings of Babylon, particularly Nabonidus, favored Nanna's cult over Marduk's, which caused considerable religious tension. Nabonidus's mother had been a high priestess of Nanna, and he attempted to elevate moon worship above the traditional Babylonian cult of Marduk, one of the factors that led to his unpopularity and eventually to Babylon's conquest by Persia. This shows how seriously religious affiliation mattered in Mesopotamian politics. You couldn't simply invent a new religious order or arbitrarily elevate one god over another without risking popular backlash, rebellion, or divine punishment as people understood it. Utu, Shamash in Akkadian, was the sun god and god of justice. These associations made perfect sense to Mesopotamians. The sun sees everything. Nothing can be hidden from its light, making Tu the perfect divine judge who knows all deeds and can render fair judgment. The sun also travels the same path every day, predictable, reliable, making it an apt symbol for justice, which should be consistent and impartial. Legal proceedings were sometimes held at temples of Shamash, and judges invoked his name when rendering verdicts. Law codes like Hammurabi's were placed under Shamash's protection, carved on stone stelae showing the king receiving the laws from the god. This wasn't just religious theatre, it reflected genuine belief that justice was divinely ordained that laws weren't merely human conventions but reflections of cosmic order established by the gods. Each god had their own mythology, their own corpus of hymns and prayers, their own festivals and rituals. Studying any one of them in depth could occupy scholars for careers. The point for our purposes is that the Anunnaki weren't a monolithic group but a diverse pantheon of distinct personalities, each with their own cults, their own cities, their own attributes and concerns, yet all connected through relationships of kinship and hierarchy, all part of the same divine order that governed cosmos and society. The Sumerian texts don't give simple answers to these questions, but they give profound ones, answers shaped by millennia of reflection and refinement, answers that influenced much of Western and Middle Eastern religious thought. They deserve our attention, our respect, our careful study. Not because we need to believe in the Anunnaki as literal gods, but because these stories contain wisdom, insight into the human condition, perspectives on meaning and purpose that are as relevant now as they were when they were first pressed into wet clay, all those thousands of years ago. The Anunnaki came to Earth in these stories as gods, as creators, as judges, as protectors and punishers. But perhaps more importantly, they came as mirrors, reflecting back to the Mesopotamians, and to us, fundamental truths about what it means to be human, to be mortal, to be part of something larger than ourselves, and in that sense, they're still with us, still shaping how we think, still asking us the same questions they asked the ancient Sumerians. What will you make of your life? What legacy will you leave? What meaning will you find in your labour? How will you relate to the powers, whatever they may be, that shape your existence? The transmission of Mesopotamian mythology to other cultures is a fascinating story in itself, showing how these ideas about the Anunnaki and cosmic order spread far beyond their original context. The Hittites and Hurrians in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, adopted Mesopotamian deities into their own pantheons, sometimes under new names, sometimes keeping the original names. Hurrian texts mention gods like Kamabi, Tesub and Shaushka, who scholars identify with Sumerian Enlil, Adad, and Ishtar respectively. The myths changed in the retelling, adapted to new cultural contexts, but core elements remained: creation through conflict, divine hierarchies, relationships between gods reflecting social relationships, humans created to serve divine purposes. This shows that the basic framework Mesopotamia developed for understanding reality resonated with neighbouring peoples, provided useful ways of thinking about the world that other cultures found valuable enough to adopt and adapt. The Israelites, who lived in Canaan at the crossroads of Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and eventually Hellenistic influences, certainly knew Mesopotamian traditions. The Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament, contains numerous parallels to Mesopotamian myths, sometimes as direct borrowings, sometimes as deliberate oppositions or reversals. The Genesis creation account, as we mentioned, parallels the Enuma Elish in structure and elements while transforming it theologically. Instead of multiple gods creating through conflict, one god creates through speech. Instead of humans made from the blood of a defeated enemy god, humans are made from earth but given the breath of God directly. The Garden of Eden story might relate to Mesopotamian paradise myths, particularly those about Dilmun, a mythical land of peace and plenty. The Tower of Babel story almost certainly refers to Babylonian ziggurats, understood as hubristic attempts to reach heaven that God prevents by confusing human language. The biblical flood story's dependence on Mesopotamian prototypes is undeniable. Noah's Ark parallels the boats of Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim in almost every detail. The periods of flooding, the animals saved, the birds sent out to test for land, the sacrifice offered after landing, all these elements appear in both traditions. Biblical authors knew these stories and adapted them, transforming a polytheistic myth about gods who need humans into a monotheistic story about God judging wickedness but showing mercy to the righteous. This process of adaptation and transformation shows how powerful the Mesopotamian narrative frameworks were. Even when later cultures wanted to tell different theological stories, they often did so by reshaping Mesopotamian templates rather than creating entirely new narrative structures. The influence extended beyond just myths and stories. Mesopotamian concepts of divine justice, of kings ruling by divine mandate, of priests mediating between human and divine, of temples as literal houses of gods, of sacrifice and offering as maintaining proper relationships with the divine. All these influenced later religions. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all developed in regions that had been part of or influenced by Mesopotamian civilization. While these monotheistic religions transformed and repudiated many Mesopotamian concepts, they also absorbed and adapted others. The idea that kings rule by divine right, that priests perform rituals essential to community welfare, that proper worship requires specific procedures and offerings, these concepts have Mesopotamian roots even if later traditions understood them quite differently. Mesopotamian astronomy and mathematics also influenced later cultures profoundly. The Greeks learned Babylonian astronomy and built on it, developing the mathematical models that would eventually be refined by Ptolemy and later astronomers. The division of the circle into 360 degrees, of the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds, these sexagesimal systems come from Mesopotamia. Our 7-day week derives from the 7 visible planets known to ancient astronomers: Sun, Moon, and 5 planets, each associated with a day, and this system was Mesopotamian in origin, though it reached us through intermediate cultures. The zodiac, the 12 signs through which the sun moves, was developed in Babylonian astronomy and passed to the Greeks, who gave the signs the names we still use today, though many were translations of earlier Mesopotamian constellation names. The very concept of astrology, that celestial phenomena have meaning for earthly events, was developed in Mesopotamia and spread throughout the ancient world and persists in various forms even today. Whether one believes in astrology's truth claims or not, its influence on human culture is undeniable, and that influence traces back to Mesopotamian priests who first systematically observed the skies and looked for correlations between celestial and terrestrial events. The idea that you can read divine will or future events in the stars, in the movements of planets, in the occurrence of eclipses, this distinctly Mesopotamian approach to understanding the cosmos became foundational to how many later cultures approached astronomy, even after the scientific revolution supposedly separated astronomy from astrology. Literature too owes debts to Mesopotamia. The Epic of Gilgamesh is recognized as one of the earliest great works of literature, and it influenced later epics, from Homer's Odyssey to Virgil's Aeneid to Dante's Divine Comedy. The structure of the hero's journey, a powerful figure who undertakes a quest, faces challenges, grows through experience, returns transformed, this narrative pattern that Gilgamesh follows and that appears in countless later works of literature and film has deep roots in Mesopotamian storytelling. The themes Gilgamesh explores, friendship, mortality, the search for meaning, the limits of human power, the inevitability of death, these universal themes were being explored in sophisticated ways in Mesopotamia, thousands of years before European literature began. The legal tradition of written law, codes, also derives from Mesopotamia. The Code of Hammurabi, carved on a stone stela around 1700 years before the Common Era, is one of the earliest comprehensive law codes we have, and it established principles and precedents that influenced later legal systems. The idea that laws should be written down, publicly displayed, consistently applied, that punishments should fit crimes, that different classes might be subject to different rules, but all should face some form of justice, these concepts have Mesopotamian origins. When we speak of presumption of innocence, of the importance of evidence, of laws being superior to arbitrary power, we're expressing principles that were being developed in Mesopotamian courts 3,000 years ago. Even our calendar systems owe something to Mesopotamia. The Babylonian calendar was lunisolar, based on moon phases, but adjusted to keep in sync with the solar year through periodic insertion of extra months. The Hebrew calendar still uses this system, and it influenced the development of calendars throughout the ancient Near East. Our months' names, in Western languages, come through Latin, but some, like September, October, November, December, which means 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th month, but are now our 9th through 12th months because the Roman calendar was adjusted, reflect the complexity of reconciling lunar and solar cycles, a problem Mesopotamian astronomers worked on extensively and developed sophisticated solutions for. All of this shows that Mesopotamian civilization, the civilization that worshipped the Anunnaki, that built ziggurats to house these gods, that recorded their myths on clay tablets, was not some isolated ancient culture whose ideas died with them. It was foundational to much of what came after, influencing law, literature, astronomy, mathematics, religion, calendar systems, concepts of kingship and justice. The Anunnaki myths were part of this larger cultural package, this framework for understanding reality that Mesopotamia developed, and that spread throughout the ancient world, being adapted and transformed but never entirely replaced. When we study the Anunnaki today, we're not just looking at quaint ancient superstitions, we're examining ideas that shaped the development of civilization, that influenced how humans organize societies, understood cosmos, related to powers greater than themselves. These were sophisticated thinkers grappling with profound questions, and their answers, while foreign to our modern sensibilities in many ways, still have things to teach us if we approach them with respect and careful attention. And this brings us back to the question of how we should understand the Anunnaki today, in our modern, scientifically informed, pluralistic world. We can't simply accept them as literal gods in the way ancient Mesopotamians did. Most of us don't believe the sun is a god travelling across the sky in a chariot, that the moon is a deity measuring time, that underground waters are ruled by Enki. We have scientific explanations for these phenomena that are more empirically accurate and predictively useful than mythological accounts. But that doesn't mean the myths have no value. They can be understood in multiple ways, all legitimate, all offering different insights. As history, they tell us about how ancient peoples understood their world, what mattered to them, how they organized their societies, what questions they grappled with. This is invaluable for understanding human cultural development, the roots of civilization, the origins of ideas and institutions that still shape our world. As literature, they're powerful stories featuring complex characters, exploring universal themes, demonstrating sophisticated narrative techniques. They deserve to be read and appreciated as works of art, as human creativity at its finest, preserving voices from thousands of years ago that still speak to us today. As psychology, they can be read as archetypal expressions of human consciousness, as Carl Jung might interpret them. The Anunnaki represent different aspects of psyche and society, ways of being in the world, principles of order and chaos, authority and creativity, justice and mercy, all of which remain relevant to human experience even if we don't frame them in terms of literal gods. This psychological reading doesn't claim historical accuracy, but finds truth in the patterns and symbols, in what they reveal about human nature and social dynamics. As theology, they're worth studying comparatively, understanding how different cultures have conceptualized the divine, related to sacred power, sought meaning and purpose through religious frameworks. For people within monotheistic traditions, studying Mesopotamian polytheism isn't about converting to ancient paganism, but about understanding religious diversity, recognizing that different cultures have asked similar questions and developed different answers, broadening our understanding of how humans relate to transcendence. And yes, for those intrigued by ancient astronaut theories, the text can be read through that lens, looking for possible descriptions of advanced technology or extraterrestrial contact encoded in mythological language. While mainstream scholarship rejects these interpretations as unsupported by evidence, and based on mistranslations or misunderstandings, exploring them at least raises interesting questions about how we interpret ancient texts, what assumptions we bring to them, how we distinguish between literal and symbolic language, historical memory and mythological elaboration. The fact that the Anunnaki can be read in all these different ways simultaneously speaks to the richness and complexity of these myths. They work on multiple levels, containing historical information, literary artistry, psychological insight, theological reflection, all wrapped together in narratives that have survived for millennia because they speak to something fundamental in human experience. The question, what happened when the Anunnaki came to Earth, might not have a single, simple answer that satisfies everyone. But exploring that question takes us on a journey through ancient history, comparative mythology, the origins of civilization, the development of religious thought, and ultimately through reflections on what it means to be human, mortal, meaning-seeking creatures in a vast cosmos. These are the questions the Anunnaki myths raise, and these are the questions worth contemplating, regardless of whether you believe these gods were literal beings, symbolic forces, distorted memories of actual events, or purely mythological constructions. The stories endure because the questions endure. And that perhaps is the real revelation of the Sumerian texts. Not that gods once walked the earth and created humanity, but that humans have always looked to the heavens have always sought meaning, have always told stories to make sense of their existence, have always honoured those stories by preserving them, copying them, passing them down through generations. The clay tablets that contain these myths are more than historical artefacts. They're testament to the human need for story, for meaning, for connection with something transcendent. As we come to the end of tonight's exploration, I hope you found value in this journey through ancient Mesopotamia, through the myths of the Anunnaki, through the complex worldview of the Sumerians and their successors. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to like it and subscribe to the channel for more content exploring ancient history, mythology, and the stories that have shaped human civilization. Let me know in the comments what aspects of this topic most interested you, whether there are related subjects you'd like me to explore in future videos, and where in the world you're watching from. Thank you for spending this time with me, delving into these ancient mysteries. The past has so much to teach us, if we're willing to listen. Until next time, take care, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember that the stories we tell about our origins shape how we understand our present and imagine our future. The Anunnaki may have been the Sumerians' answer to the mystery of existence, but we each must find our own answers, drawing on the wisdom of those who came before while forging our own understanding of what it means to be human in this vast, mysterious cosmos. Good night.